What's up guys, hope you're doing well. Welcome back to the channel. In this video, we're going to be going over how to create a settings controller for your application. So this is what it looks like, the completed application. We have multiple sections that allow for different options. And I'm going to be showing you how to implement action handlers for each one of those sections, as well as how to implement functionality to add certain UI components to certain cells in certain sections. So it's some pretty complicated TableView stuff. I'm going to be explaining everything very thoroughly and in a lot of detail throughout this, so you guys really understand what's going on. And what's cool about this is you can really use this as a template for your applications, like a settings template, because it's a scalable solution. So it's really simple for you to either add sections, remove sections, or add section options to your sections, like edit profile, logout, or all this stuff here. So you guys are going to be learning how to do all of this stuff in this video. I hope you're excited about it. Let's go ahead and get started with Xcode now. All right guys, so if you haven't already, make sure you go ahead and download the source code for this project. It leaves you with the application looking like this, and then we are going to go from this point forward to get our settings controller set up. And again, it's going to look like this. So right now we have this navigation controller, this header view, and we're going to start setting this stuff up now. But before we do that, I'm just going to go over sort of really quickly everything we did to set this stuff up. So we have our view controller here. We have this table view variable. This is the function where we configure our table view, set our delegate, data source, and row height. And then what we do from there is we register our table view cell, which is the settings cell here. Add our table view to the subview, set the frame, and then here we create our user info header, which is this file right here. So that contains a profile image view, a username label, and an email label, which is what we see up here. And then here in our init function, we just add our those subviews to the main view through these programmatic constraints. And then we create that user info header here with this frame. And then we set the table header view to that user info header. And this line of code here just eliminates all the unnecessary separator lines in our table view. So it only gives us as many separator lines as we have cells, which is nice. And this is our configure UI function. We just call that configure table view, set up our navigation bar, and we call that function up in our view.load. And then down here, we're going to be getting into these functions right now, where we set up our table view, data source, our sections, and all that stuff. So that's what we're going to be doing now. Let's go ahead and get started. Guys, so let's hop into our table view delegate and data source extension of our view controller here. We look at this function and we see it's called number of rows in section, and we're returning 5. So that's why we're getting back 5 cells here. In our completed application, we have 2 sections. So we need to tell our code to render 2 sections in our table view. So go here and say number of sections and select that function, number of sections in table view, and we're going to return 2. And then if we were to run our code now, we'll notice that we get back 10 cells because we have 5 cells in each section. So we have 1, 2, all the way down to 10 now. So that's what that does. Now, if we look at our completed application, we notice that we have only 2 cells in the first section, and then we have 3 cells in the second section. So how do we do that? Well, we're going to go to this number of rows in section function, and we have access to what section we are in our table view. So we're going to say in our first section, return 2 cells. In our second section, return 3. So just go here and say switch section, and we're going to say case 0. Case 1, and default. And in the default case, you can just say break. So in the first section, we're going to return 2. So say return 2. Actually here, because we have to return an integer, just say return 0. And then in our second section, we're going to say return 3. So if we were to hit Command B to see if this is all good, it's looking good. Now, if we run our code, actually, let's go ahead and give each one of these cells a background color so we can see that this is how this is working. So go here and just copy and paste this code in our cell for row at function. So this is the function that renders out our cells. So instead of here, it switch index path dot section. So through our index path, we have access to what section we are in our table view. So here we're not returning anything. So oops, whoa, what did I do? My bad, guys. So here just it default say break, and here say cell.background color equals .blue, and then here say cell.background color equals .red. So this will give you guys a clearer understanding of what exactly is going on. So we notice in our first section, we get back 2 cells and they're red, and then in our second section we get back 3 cells and they're blue. So to go over that really quickly one more time, we defined the number of rows we want in a particular section in this function. So in section 0, which is this section, we return 2 cells. In section 1, we return 3. And we have to add this default case in because we're working within a switch statement, and we just return 0 there. And then in our cell for row at function, where our cells actually get rendered out, we're saying, okay, we're going to switch through the index path.section. So this index path guy, we have access to the section and the row that we are in. So we're looking at the section 0 here when we say switch index path.section. And we set that cell background color to red, and in this case, and then in the second section we set it to blue. So that's kind of the foundation for how we're going to set up our table view sections and cells. So now that we've done that, let's actually get started with rendering out these section titles and these views here for our sections. So let's go back into our code. Let me clean this up a little bit. And let's just go ahead and create this function called view for header in section. So this function is going to allow us to return a UI view, and it's going to create that as our section header. So that's what, again, what we have here with this. This is our section header here, where we see social and communication. So now let's go ahead and set this up really quickly. So we're just going to say let view equals UI view, and then we're going to say view.background color, and we're going to grab this UI color guy that we have here. So just go up and copy and paste that. Ideally, we'd want to make an extension for UI color and create a function to give us back this this color, which we can probably implement later on, depending on how we're doing on time. So now we're going to say let title equal UI label. Title.font equals UI font dot bold system font of size 16. Title.text color equals .white. And then we're going to say view.add subview title. Title.translates auto resizing masking to constraints equals false. So we actually have to say this to activate our programmatic constraints. Then we're going to say title.center y anchor .constraint, and go and select this option, just equal to. Then we're going to say view.center y anchor is active equals true. And then we're going to say title.left anchor .constraint. And we want to select this guy here, the NS layout constraint, and the constant, because we need some padding. Then we're going to say view.left anchor, constant is going to be 12, and then we're going to say, actually let's make this like 16. Then say dot is active equals true. And we need to set the text for this. So we'll say title.text, equals test. And then we are going to go down here and we need to return this view. So it's asking us to return a view. So we basically set up this view, gave it a background color, added this title label to it, gave that title label some attributes, added it to the view, and we're returning that view. Now, one more function we need to implement is height for header in section. And we're just going to say return 40. So let's go ahead and run our code now, and we'll see those sections coming up. So that's looking pretty good. We see test and test here. We can actually just go ahead and delete this. We don't want those weird colors. Let's go ahead and run it and see what it looks like without them. So that's looking pretty good, guys. We have 3 cells here and we have 2 cells there. Okay, so now that that's set up, we need to actually start setting up the data for these cells. And that's sort of the main part of this video, right? So we want to be able to create these options here for for an individual section. And we notice here that we added like a switch statement to, or sorry, a switch control to these cells, and we don't have them up here. So this is pretty common format of what a settings controller is going to look like. You're going to have multiple sections. Some cells are going to have some different UI components or some different attributes that you might want to have, and we're going to be learning how to do that now. So let's go ahead and start coding out what we need to do to make this work. Okay guys, so let's talk a little bit about how exactly we're going to do this. So we just have one settings cell, and we need each one of those text labels to have a different like option text, right? Edit, profile, logout, notifications. And then we need some of these cells to have this guy here as well, this switch control. But we're only going to be doing using this settings cell, and we're going to be able to configure this cell with some different options based on what we're going to be doing. So we're going to be using enumerations to create this stuff. And we're going to see how powerful enumerations can be in doing something like creating or populating table views. So let's hop up to our model, and we're going to create a new file. So hit Command N, and we're going to call this settings settings section. Yeah. Okay, and we don't need this import guy here. So we're going to create an enum for our settings sections first. So we're going to say enum settings sections, or settings sections. I don't know. That's fine. I said settings section. Okay. And it's going to conform to a couple things. It's going to be of type int, and it's going to conform to the case iterable protocol as well as the custom string convertible protocol. And I know this might not make sense to you guys right now, but it will as we go on. So what we're going to do is say case social and case communications. So we're going to use this enumeration here to populate or set up our sections. So we see that we have social and communication. So right now we conform to this custom string convertible protocol, which means we need to implement this description variable. So we'll see how this is used in a second. Go ahead and say switch self, and sorry guys, delete that. Say case.social and case.communications. Return communications, and here return social. Okay, so we have this enum. We have this description variable available to get the text that we need for those for our section headers, and we are going to see why we conform or make this enum of type integer in just a second. So let's hop back to our view controller, and let's go to this number of sections function really quick. And instead of returning this like constant value of 2, this isn't really good programming practice here, because say we wanted to add a section in, we would go into this enum, and we want to be able to access the number of cases that we have in order to tell our table view how many sections to create. So that's where we're going to be using this case iterable protocol. So, and the beauty of this is when we add a section or remove a section, we don't have to go back to this function and change the value here. So we're just going to say return settings section dot all cases dot count. So this functionality here will give us back the amount of cases that we have in that enum. In this case, it's 2, and that's how many sections we want in our table view. So now we need to set up the text for our sections. So we're going to be doing that when we set this title text down here. And it's also, we're also going to see the power of conforming to that, or making that enum of type integer right now. So we're going to go ahead and say title.text equals settings section, and we're going to initialize this with a raw value, and it's going to be that section. And then we're going to say dot description. So there's a lot of stuff happening here. Excuse me, but it's actually really cool, and it's very powerful because of how simple it is. So we instantiate this settings section with a raw value. that's what we are able to do because we conform to this integer, or set this enum up as an integer enum. So essentially, it's assigning a value of 0 to social, and it's assigning a value of 1 to communications. And we don't have to declare this because Swift does that automatically for us, which is really cool. Excuse me, guys. So we can go ahead and delete that. So now when we initialize that section, it asks us for a raw value. So if I were to pass in 0, it would give me back social. If I were to pass in 1, it would give me back communications. So this view for header and section function gets called twice because we have 2 sections. So because we have 2 sections up here, we have to render out that view for each section twice. Or if we had 3, it would get called 3 times. So the first time it gets called, we're going to say print, let's just go ahead and see this in action. Section is, and then say section. So basically the first time it gets called, it's on section 0. So then it's going to say title.text equals settings section, and the value of this section is going to be 0. So then it's going to go back to the settings section, and it's going to say, okay, that's our social guy. And then when we say dot description, when we're on our social case, it returns social as the text that we get back. And then when we're on 1, it is the communications case, and that description variable is going to be, the case is going to hit the communications state, and it's going to return this guy here. So let's go ahead and run this and see if that's working, and it should be. And we're going to look at this print statement here to see how many times this function gets called. And we notice that it gets called twice, just like we talked about. Settings section is 0 for the first time, and then 1 the second time. And then our text renders out very nicely by calling on this description variable and initializing our settings section enum with the section that we have access to here. So again, guys, the first time it's passing in 0, which links to social. The second time it's passing in 1, which links to communications. So this is really the foundation for how we are going to be rendering out our table view. We did that for our sections, and now we're going to be creating enumerations for the cells that we are going to be placing in each of those sections. So we're going to be creating an enumeration for our social options and our communications options, and we're going to populate those cells using those enumerations. Very similar to what we just did with our settings section. So let's go ahead and get started with that now. Okay guys, so hop back into your settings section file, and we're going to go outside of this, and we are going to create another enumeration, and this is going to be called social options, and it's going to conform to that integer protocol and the case iterable protocol and the custom string convertible protocol as well. And then we can go ahead and just copy and paste this and create our communication options enum as well. And it's going to conform to all the same things. So now what we need is to set these cases up, right? So similar to how we did social and communications, we're going to go down here and create all these cases now. So we're going to say case edit profile, case logout, and then here we're going to say case notifications, case email, and case report crashes. And I'm doing these starting with lowercase because our settings section is sort of like a parent, right? It's like these are contained within our settings section. So that's why I'm choosing to make these capital. You don't have to. I just think it makes a little bit more sense. And it's pretty easy to see what's going on here, I think. We're just creating cases for each one of these guys. And now we need to set up our description variable as well for each one. So let's just go ahead and copy and paste that. We're going to say case edit profile, case logout. And this gives us back the text that we want. So this is going to say edit profile. This is going to say logout. And then we're going to copy and paste the same down here. Say case notifications, return notifications, case email, return email, and then we need to add one more in, so we're going to say case.report crashes, and then we're going to say return report crashes. Okay, now let's go ahead and really quickly just build our project to make sure we're not getting any errors, and that's looking good. So now we are going to go back into our view controller and actually set up these cells using those enums that we just created. And here, again, similar to what we did with the count for our sections, we want to make sure we're being good programmers with how we set up the count for each one, the number of rows in each of our sections. So these are just hard-coded values. So once again, if I were to add or take away values from these two enums, I would have to then go back and change them here as well manually. And that's not good programming practice. So what we're going to do is very similar to what we did here. Our zero case is our social options. So we'll say return social options.allcases.count. And actually, a better way to do this is to, let's construct our section here really quick. So we'll say guard let section equal settings section, raw value section, else return 0. And I'll explain this in a little bit, guys. So now when we switch through this section, we're going to say case.social and case.communications. So this is a little bit more robust, right? We're not just looking at the 0 section and the 1 section. Now we're actually constructing this section for based on the enum that we created, and then we can switch through the cases of that enum instead of just switching through the cases of that section. So this makes a lot more sense. So because if somebody else were to look at your code and they said they would have to sort of figure out that the social options was the 0 section and the communications option was the 1 section. This makes it a lot more clear to understand and makes your code a lot more robust. So now we're going to say return communications, communication options dot all cases dot count. And okay, default, yeah, we don't need this default statement anymore because we have exhausted through all the options of our switch. So that's looking really good. Now we need to go down to our cell for row at index path function and do some stuff here. So we need to switch back through, so we need to create this section again. And guys, the reason this is through a guard statement is because when you initialize this with a raw value, it's optional. So we use a guard statement to unwrap it, and if it fails, we just return 0 for the number of rows in our section. But it should never fail. So now we're going to do the same thing and say, let's just go ahead and copy and paste this. So now this is where we're going to define the cells for our social section and our communication section, and it's actually very simple. So we're just going to say guard let social options, or just say social equals social options, and we're going to pass in the raw value of our index path.row, else return. Now we don't need a guard statement there because it's annoying to have to return a UI table view cell. So we can just sort of leave that as optional because we know our section is already rendered, so we don't have to unwrap that as well. It's just kind of unnecessary. So now in here we're going to say let communications equal communication options, and then pass in our index path.row. And we will say cell.textLabel.text equals social.description and communications. And then we're going to go down here and say cell.textLabel.text equals communications.description. And then here, let's just go ahead and tell our code. Yeah, see, this is what I was talking about. So here we just need to return a UI table view cell if that fails. Go ahead and run our code and let's see if this is working, and then I'm going to explain what's going on. What the heck is going on? Oh, index path, not section. So we need to access our section through this index path that we have here, which again contains a section and a row. So this is our completed application. This is the application we're working on now. Our completed application is over here with the switches. We haven't implemented that yet. So this is exactly what we want, right? This is starting to look really good. Let's go over really quickly what exactly we did. So we created our section. We initialized our section with this through access of this index path section that we have here. So the first one it's going to create is going to be social. Then it's going to, the next time it gets called, this section will be equal to communications. So in this switch statement is where we handle setting up the cell for each one of our sections. So in our social section, we create our social options enum. And in this case, we're passing in the index path.row. So in the first section, it's going to say the index path.row is equal to 0 and 1. And then in our communications, the index path.row is equal to 0, 1, and 2. So if we go back to our settings section, 0 is going to be edit profile, 1 is going to be log out, and then when we call this description guy, it's going to give us back the corresponding strings that we have through access of this description variable. When we through access of this switch statement that we created. So when we switch on the self, it's switching on the social options. We go through these two things and return these strings, and that's how we get those back there. And the same holds true for the communication section. So this is all looking very, very nice. Now all we need to do is implement the functionality to add those switch controls to our cells. But it presents an interesting problem because we only want to add them to a certain section. And we can actually go even further to only add them to certain cells in certain sections, which is very cool. So we're going to go ahead and get started with what we need to do there. Okay, so let's hop into our settings cell. And what we're going to do right now is add the code to programmatically construct our switch. So that's what this is going to look like. Go to your property section and add this code in. You can copy and paste it or pause the video and type it out. This is how we programmatically construct our UI switch. I call it switch control. We set it to a lazy variable because if we don't, this action handler won't work. We set it to on as a default value, give it a tint color, say this is false so we can programmatically add our constraints. And right now we need to create this function. So this function will get executed every time our switch's value gets changed, aka every time it gets toggled between on and off. So we're going to say mark selectors and then add objective-c func and paste that guy in there. Whoa, my bad. And we need to pass in an input parameter in this function. And the only input parameter we're able to pass in is that of a UI switch, because we're adding this as a target to a UI switch. We can have access to what we call a sender, which is of type UI switch, which enables us to access certain attributes and properties about this UI switch. So we're going to want to be able to tell if it's on or off. So this sender input parameter will allow us to do that. So we can say if sender.isOn, and that is on Boolean property is a property we get through access of this which we are able to access through the sender, which is of type UI switch. Then we'll just say print turned on, and then else print turned off. So now we just need to add that switch control to our cell. So go into your init method in your cell and just add this code. This adds the switch control. We center it on the y-axis of the cell, so it's going to end up like right here. And then we pin it to the right side and give it a padding of -12, which moves it over to the left by 12 pixels. That's why we say -12, because if we didn't, it would move it over to the right by 12 pixels, which would make it look off screen. So let's now run this code and see what this looks like. So we notice that we're getting our switch. It's looking really nice. And when we turn it off, it says turned off. That's because it's executing this handle switch action function, and it noticed that it was turned off, so it gives us this print statement. And then when I turn it back on, it will say turned on. So you can see how that's useful, because in your settings, adding this switch, the users will be able to toggle things on and off, and this is where you will be able to add that functionality. So now what we need to do is implement the functionality to add this to certain cells and certain sections, and that's a little bit tricky. So what we're going to do is go to our settings section, and we're going to create a protocol. And this protocol will require the implementation of a Boolean variable that determines whether or not we will add a switch. And then in our enumerations, we will conform to that protocol. And then when once we conform to that protocol, we will be able to tell our enum which cells get that switch and which cells don't. So let's go ahead and create that protocol. Let's just call it section type. And we're going to create a variable called contains switch. And it's going to be a Boolean, and it's going to require a get. So this is virtually identical to that of our description variable here that we get through, that we are required to conform to through this custom string convertible protocol. We're doing the same thing, we're just creating a custom protocol and requiring that we implement a Boolean variable. And much like our description, it will require us to return something. So this requires us to return a string. This is going to require us to return a Boolean variable. So what we're going to do is actually have this conform to custom string convertible as well. And we'll see why in a second. So we can now go to our social options and communication options and implement this protocol. We're not going to implement it in our settings section because the switch, whether it's contained or not, is completely irrelevant in our settings section. It's only relevant in our social options and communication options. So because this protocol conforms to custom string convertible, we can actually delete this and then conform to this section type protocol. So conform to that, and then go down here and conform to that as well. And it's going to give us an error because we are not conforming to this protocol. We need to implement this variable, much like we implemented this description variable as through a requirement of our custom string convertible protocol. So go ahead and say var contains switch, and it shows up automatically because it recognizes that we are conforming to this protocol. So contains switch. And in this case, we don't need to do a switch statement. We can just say return false because none of these sections require us to do that. And then down here, we can pick and choose which cases we want to add that switch to. So go ahead and implement the same thing. Var contains switch, switch, switch self, case.notifications, case.email, case.report crashes. And for report crashes, for the sake of learning or seeing how this works, let's return false. And then here we'll say return true. And here we'll say return true. So this is going to add our switch control to our notifications in our email cells, but not our report crashes case. So now how do we implement this to check and see what's up with this contains switch variable? So we're going to go back to our settings cell, and this is a really cool trick that is available to us through the graces of Swift. So we can create a variable called section type, and it's going to be of type section type, and then we'll say did set. And then we are going to say text label dot text, equals section type dot description. Implement a question mark because it's still optional. And we notice that it's still gonna, our build will succeed, which is looking really good. And then we're gonna go here and say switch control dot is hidden equals section type dot contains switch, but we need to do the opposite of that. So what this is saying is if section type dot contains switch is true, we want to set is hidden to false, right? Actually, let's go up here and say let section type equal section type return. So we don't have to implement these as optional. And then if we build our project, that's going to look good. So I know this is probably confusing right now. I'm going to go ahead and finish out the code and then explain it in a little bit more detail. So go back to your view controller and let's go to this cell for row at function. And here we are setting the cell's text label through our view controller. And what we can now do, and this is really cool, is say cell.section type equals social. And now here we can say cell.section type equals communications. So this is a really cool feature, and let's go ahead and run this and see if it's working, and then I will explain everything in more detail. And we notice that we are getting back our notifications, the switch for this guy, but not our report crashes. And if we go back to our settings section, that's exactly what we wanted, because here we said we wanted it to return true, true, and then here we said false. And if I were to change this to true and run this again, we'll notice that we get that switch back in each one of our sections, just like this. And then our action handler is working there nicely as well. So that's super cool. And let me go over the explanation as to why this works. So because these two enums conform to this section type, and this section type protocol is up here, and we implement this, we say section type conforms to custom string convertible, which gives us access to that description variable, which we have here, and same thing for communication options. And then we have this contains switch variable. So in our settings cell, we create this section type variable, and we say, okay, when it sets, I want you to do this. So whenever we set this section type, this did set method gets executed, and it sets our text label text, which is this guy here, and it determines whether or not that switch control is hidden. And we set that variable in our cell for row at index path function that we have access through our TableView data source protocol. So we are able to set this social options enum, where we initialize it here, as that variable, because this social options enum conforms to that section type protocol. So what we did was set this variable to be of type section type, which is the protocol that we created here. And because these two enums conform to that protocol, we are able to set that variable as when we say cell.section type equals social, because the social options enumeration conforms to that protocol, we don't get any problems. And again, this social enumeration is this edit profile and logout guy, and then the communications guy here is where it really matters. Because we create this communications option enumeration based on what cell we are looking at, whether it's 0, 1, or 2. So if we're at notifications, and we would go back to our settings section, then the reason we get back notifications as the text label is because when we hit this switch statement, or this case in our switch statement, that's what it tells us to return. Similarly with this contains switch variable, when we hit this notifications case, it returns true. So meaning we want this switch control to show up. And then in our settings cell, when we set this guy, we say switch control.isHidden is equal to section type.contains switch. So the opposite of that. So the exclamation point negates whatever that Boolean variable is. So if we want it to show up, in this case it's true, is hidden gets set to false. So when we say is hidden is equal to false, that means it actually shows up. When is hidden is true, as in the case of these guys, it doesn't show up. And because in our settings section, in our social options, we return false for this contains switch variable, it doesn't show up in our cells. And one more thing that's really cool to be able to implement and illustrates the power of using enumerations to populate a table view is when we implement this did select row at method. Because when you guys implement the settings controller and use this as a template in your applications, you're going to notice that you're going to want to be able to implement the functionality so when the user selects this cell, something happens. And this did select row at function gets called every time the user selects a specific cell. So we're going to implement this section here. just how we did up there. And in this case, we don't have to return anything. So we'll just say else return. And then we can switch through that section, just like we did up there, and implement some type of action handler. So we can say, we don't need to set anything here. This is just what gets executed when we select a row. We can say print dot description and go here and say print dot description. And when I run this code, we will notice that whatever the cell's text label is, it's going to print out. Edit profile there, log out there, so on and so forth. And then our action handler is still working as well. So this is going to be it for the implementation of your settings controller, guys. I know it got a little complex. This is some pretty high level stuff, but it's exactly what you would see in the professional world. I actually implemented a settings controller just like this in my actual job, and I used these same techniques. And that's like an app that's live in production that's used by millions of people on a daily basis. So I know it's a little confusing, but in order to really excel yourself or improve your skills as a developer, it's important to step outside your comfort zone and do things like this. So I think I did a pretty decent job of explaining everything that went on, and I think this really showcases the power of enumerations in populating table views. We created separate sections and stuff, and what's really cool about this is it's extremely easy to modify and to scale. So if I wanted to add a section, all I would have to do is create another case, say like case test, and that's going to cause some errors, but it's really easy to like implement another section or implement another social option or communication option. And all you have to do is go and add in your cases to the switch statements, and you will be able to add things. You can turn switches off or on. So this is a really scalable solution to implementing a settings controller. It looks pretty as well, which is really nice. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Please subscribe to the channel if you liked it, and thanks for watching, guys. Peace out, everybody.